I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West. Well, Pete, today we are talking about something that we thought we'd already talked about, but we hadn't, which is connection.
Well,
Hi.
because it seems like something that we often talk about, but because we do, but so now we're going to just give a whole episode just to connection.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I think you're right. Like, I think we say the word connection all the time.
Yeah.
We talk about like connection to values. We did an episode on sex and connection. We talk about connection to those we love. But, I think it's like a word that, honestly, it's funny. I've been thinking about this quite a bit recently. I feel like it's been coming up in my work a lot where it's maybe something that we don't always define. It's like one of those, it's kind of like values in general. People are like, I know I have values, but I guess I've not really like sat down and like got really clear about what it means. And I think connection is one of those experiences that doesn't get operationalized that often.
Yeah, because perhaps people are afraid of losing connection, right? Because sometimes you you think you're connected, but you're not. And yet we all have those friends that perhaps we are super connected with where we might not talk to them very often. And then when we do, it's like we spoke yesterday. I know you like my definition. So actually one of them is a supplier of narcotics, but that's not what we're talking about.
That is hands down not what we're talking about at all here. No.
It's funny that came up, but it's
Okay.
a connection in which a person, thing, or idea is linked or associated with something else, And so, but what does that mean in terms of psychology? I guess that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, because I think that definition is that's definitely a Merriam-Webster, huh?
Yes.
Is that what it is? Yeah. That sounds very very like of the physical world, kind of like connect. Like you connect. I don't know. Like I was connecting this microphone to my AirPods. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's a kind of connection. But yeah, like how does it factor into psychology?
Yeah.
And I think like maybe that's where I can provide my own definition here, operationalized.
Please do.
That's if I may.
You may.
Yes. So connection it's interesting. I think it's something it's technically not tangible, right? Like we can't see it, we can't measure it.
Yeah.
Former supervisee of mine, we used to talk a lot about like the vibes that you feel, and she told me, shout out to Olivia. She if she listens to this, she told me one day she's gonna create a scale to measure vibes, and she's gonna name it after me. And I was like, thank you, that's very kind. So it's something they're saying, like we can't see it, and yet we all know when we're connected and when we're disconnected, both to ourselves or to other, I'm going to say, living beings. It's not just, or actually nature, anything. We know the feeling of being connected. And it's just interesting because it's like something, there's like a resonance to it. There's a depth. There's like, this is where it starts, I think, get a little bit intertwined with values or even spirituality, right?
Yeah.
It's a very nourishing experience. And the thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is how connection and love are not the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
That I think about, like, we often think like you're really connected to people you love, but I think there are people that I love very deeply, and that there's times where I feel more or less connected to them for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So I'll pause for a second. What do you think about
my
definitions?
Well, I want us to clarify them just to
sure.
And I think that it is I think we're going to see a lot in the East. You mentioned spirituality, and I think connection is something, because some of our listeners will probably not, we'll get it, but like you said, you can't measure it, but yet we've all known when something feels right. And that's what connection is. That's the vibes. What was the word you said?
Vibes. Like it's vibes. Yeah.
It's totally vibes, especially in the practice of therapy.
Yes. Yeah. And it's probably hard, maybe kind of going back to like, why do we not define it? It's because like in some ways it's hard to define like language. We talk a lot about this on this podcast. Language has a lot of limitations, and like words don't exactly capture it,
Pause there for a second.
Okay,
I think that's probably the definition.
That words don't capture what the experience of connection is.
So we'll say what it's not, but that's really, I think, what it is, because you can't truly measure it. You can't see it. Well, maybe someone could see it. I mean, maybe it's going to be in our episode of psychedelics, because I think there's things of like, aura and right. I mean, I think
sure, but even that I would say like it's still not the experience. Those might be things that like hint at or suggest or represent, just like words and language represents connection, but it's the old like you know when you feel it and you know when you don't. And I certainly think about that a lot of like, I know when I feel connected to people in my life or to animals. I know when I feel connected to nature or not. I know when I feel connected to my own spirituality or not. And, you know, like, obviously, like, I don't feel connected to everything all the time. I think that's also important to know too, is like, we will feel disconnection. That's part of living a human life. You know, we're tired or whatever.
Absolutely.
And not having enough connection or not returning back to it is very, I guess, I don't know, maybe like draining, like leads to burnout. I don't know. Does that
I mean, I think we did something on compassion fatigue. So it could, right? Because if you're super connected, you're having compassion. And you could easily get burnt out. I'm curious, because you started this by saying you've been thinking a lot about how connection and love are not the same. So maybe just
say more about no, I think it's more just, I think what I was saying a moment ago in terms of, I don't know, I guess I've always thought about like when you really love somebody, you're really connected to them. And I've just thought about certain relationships in my life at this stage in my life where I feel less connected to some people. And I don't mean less connected, like not talking to people. I mean like a depth of connection. And it's not I don't mean this is a bad thing, by the way. I just mean it like experientially, but that doesn't actually negate or water down the depth of my love for those people. And I think that's just something that in my own self, I kind of was like surprised about. Like I always think about feeling disconnected, like, you know, in a partnership or friends, like sometimes you feel connected, sometimes you're not, whatever. But I thought, sometimes there are times where, you know, given somebody's own self-growth or self-evolution, they're just not able to go as deep for whatever reason. And that's going to impact how deep of a connection you can feel with somebody. And but that doesn't mean you don't love them. I don't know. It's like, you know, like you can really love somebody that you're not as connected to.
And when you say that, I think of like psychological insight, like, so, right? Because if it's hard to say be connected with someone that you're not at the same level of psychological insight.
Yes.
And so it does take some values or similarities to connect. And from the East, we have yin and yang. And so, you know, yin and yang, most of you know, most listeners have heard of that. And it's really the like sort of a homeostatic approach to life, that everything needs to be balanced out. And so even in some part of connection, opposites do attract. So I want to be clear for our listeners, it's not that we have to have all similarities, like the same level of psychological insight or intellect or interests, you know. So
well, there'll be like, I think that's interesting, because I think like, because I hear what you're saying and I think that's true. I think I'm more speaking to the piece of like, there are times when like, I don't know, I'll use this as an example. I'm thinking of like, people talk about in like therapy a lot, for example, maybe they have a parent who is kind of like not understanding something in their life for whatever reason, or the parent has certain kind of psychological limitations. And so they can't, the patient doesn't feel that connected to that parent, but the person might also really love their parent. And like, I think that's more what I'm talking about, which is like, because that part, like, I think sort of like surprised me when I started to notice that or think about it, right? Of like, you know, because sometimes other times we really, really love somebody and we also feel really deeply connected to them at the same time. And I think it's just important to know, like, if you have someone in your life that you really love, but the connection isn't as deep as you want it to be, that's okay. Like, there's love there. The love, it's like, they're different things.
Yeah, well, they're mutually exclusive, perhaps. And what I was actually thinking is, how do we foster connection?
How do we cultivate it?
Yeah. So
what do you? Well, I'm going to ask you. I was going to ask you, since you were thinking about it. You know,
I was thinking to ask you, but okay. Yeah. I mean, so ways that people can cultivate connection could be through vulnerability. It could be through, so that's what that would mean. It would be sharing, you know, so sharing some stories with somebody about something that you're, you know, feeling challenged about or not, you know, or something that's going really well. It could be meditating together or praying together, you know, It could be going hiking, on every Saturday, so things that you can do to try and foster it. Because it's interesting because I hear exactly what you're saying in terms of the, relationship with love, and anybody that's loved something or someone knows that there's times in that where you don't feel connected, and that's okay.
And that's okay. That's just human. And it's, well, and I think what you're bringing up is also important in that it gets a real dialectic here, right? Because yes, there are things that we can do to deepen connection and all, there's sharing activities, sharing, your own emotional world. Vulnerability is actually like a necessary ingredient for
connection
and I would say to deepen connection.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Because there's also like different types of connection, different levels of it.
Yeah.
And then I was actually thinking when you were talking, like another aspect of it is like practicing authenticity, like being yourself, like being wholly yourself. And that, tends to also attract others that are also being wholly themselves. And there's, I don't know, room for connection in that. I think that's something that I've experienced quite a bit of.
Well, and so when you think about that, what would you say about connecting with colleagues? Because I think, so you said there's different types of connection. So there's, we're thinking about, we've mentioned family, maybe friendships, and is probably a spectrum, that connection.
That's what I was just thinking. It's like a spectrum or degrees, and it's like how everything is. It's like and all of the degrees along that spectrum are all valid, right? It's just sort of like what's workable for you with this individual, this situation, this this person or animal. And I mean, I think like that's, I think, look, it can be tempting, having human brains, right, to like put really deep connection up on a pedestal. And I would say, deep connection can be very nourishing. And also like, we also need just like light connection sometimes too. Sometimes, maybe you're just like, to be honest, like you can feel a sense of connection just to humans. Like if you're like walking around your neighborhood, feeling the energy of the people around you, it's not, I think that's just important too, that there's like a variability in the ways we can experience it. And it's important to check in with yourself about like, where do I want and where do I need connection, and then how do I get that? Right.
Yeah. Because all of us have probably been on a subway or a yoga class or a plane and maybe not even spoken with somebody and yet felt connected, because we had a shared experience,
moment.
A shared moment. And so that is something that we could also think about. In the East, there's really the teaching here is like interconnectedness or, right. This idea that everything is connected, the air we breathe is connected, and, that we all share a same light, so anyone that's ever taken yoga, when you say namaste at the end, you're saying like, I see the light inside of you that's inside of me. And that is, for me, that's actually when I first started studying the Buddhism, I started with more of the Tibetan literature, which was more about that. And so I remember like in grad school, kind of walking around and looking at trees and trying to create connection, because that's a lot of what they taught. And then I'm a slow learner, so it wasn't until like years later that like
far from the truth, but
I recognized like tree hugging, and I was like, oh right, this is like it's sort of a pejorative thing to say, and it's a very powerful experience to truly feel these living things that have been here for hundreds of years for some of them,
Well, and I think, I'm glad you're bringing up the concepts of interconnectedness, because I think what we want to make sure that we say is, obviously, and Pete and I always make sure to, bring in context here and cultural context, and we're Americans, right? And we talk, and American culture is highly individualistic, and that's not bad. I want to be clear, right? It's not bad. It's just a version of society, a value that's valued here. And so I think that interconnectedness is often a very difficult concept for a lot of Americans, and probably other cultures that ascribe to an individualistic worldview, because we think of ourselves as separate, right? Like we think of ourselves as separate. And what I think is really interesting is that the concept of interconnectedness, which is talked about, and obviously all these Eastern spiritual traditions, it also aligns, I love my physics, books, is that, we can also think about through like a Western physics lens, nothing is separate. Everything is made of atoms.
That's right.
Everything is made of, molecules, atoms, that we tend to think of space, literally like the air, as like, oh, my skin ends and then there's air. It's like, no. Everything is made of atoms. There is separateness is an illusion. And so I just think that's a very difficult concept, conceptually, for the way that, and at least in American society, we tend to frame things. It's like, I am the individual and my skin ends and then there's this thing on the outside of my body, as opposed to like, no, it's all made of the same stuff here.
Well, and that's where we say there is no I.
Yes.
There is no me. And so sometimes, as I've done like interviews, or they'll say like, oh, what are your credentials and all this stuff? And I'm like, none. They're like, wait, what? It's like, well, because they don't matter. And that's also like this like Eastern idea of emptiness, which is often like directly linked with interconnectedness or interdependence. Emptiness is the idea that, sort of what you're just saying, is that it's all empty too, like, molecules and the, protons, neutrons, electrons, like there's no starting or end point to any of it.
Right. And I think, I know I've mentioned this before, it's like where the translation, I think, to English also makes it hard to understand. Like the term empty is probably not a great word, right? That even that's what's used, because it's like our brains are like, yeah, nothing. And it's like, no, it's the opposite of nothing. It's filled with something. And so, like we've been talking, Pete and I, we need to do an episode on psychedelics. Neither him nor I are experts in the new psychedelic therapies. We definitely want to have a guest on that. But if anybody out there has read any of the articles about some of the literature I've read, I went to a really interesting training about it. One of the most common things in psychedelic assisted therapy, or anybody, if you a listener or anybody has ever used psychedelic substances, one of the things most people report is this experience of like losing the self and the connection and a connectedness to everything. And I think that's so powerful and obviously fascinating. But anyway, I mean, so connection.
And it made me think that I just, with a client recently, I was saying, but what also think about like a geriatric, like someone who's like 80 or 90, like what are they worried about? And so they get to a place of less worry, especially as they've done, what is it? Integrity versus despair. Eric's in this like last stage of sort of reflecting on life and what I've done, who I am. And then at that point, none of that actually matters. You're really just in the moment, which that could be seen also as emptiness. Emptiness, you're right, with the translation piece. There's also this idea of like zero, in some of the other translations, which does the interconnectedness piece as well, because it's like, and I guess like you started off by saying, is our brains, and especially in the West, do not like this, right? No. We want a hierarchy, we want a math problem, everything. I mean, I literally just referenced physics. I mean, we want a logic, and we want things to be neat, right? Yeah. We want like thinking of our bodies as separate. It's like, it's just like more contained. I mean, it makes sense. And again, whether you live in a Western culture or not, you have a human brain. And so some degree of this is going to exist in all of us. And I think, really, I know, seems like Pete and I, we really got a little bit away from our initial sort of topic of connection. Well, not really. Well, if you let me finish, I was I'm sorry.
It seemingly got away from it, but it's like ultimately what we're getting away from is to see like this is about connecting, that like letting go of the self and seeing the interconnectedness of all things. And there's that there is no such thing as nothingness. Everything is, there's everything's made of atoms. It's like connection is available literally at any moment, in all situations, in varying degrees, but we have to be willing to open up to that, I would say.
Yeah. And you and I are connected.
We are. That is true.
And so what, as we're wrapping up, like what are some sort of last things about ways of connecting, or so for maybe a listener out there that's wanting to, like we said, some of them, but I'm wondering, ways that you and I stay connected from on the East and West Coast? Or... Yes.
Well, I think it's like what you said, Pete, which is like, there are obviously like, there are the sort of tangible practices of making time and space for the people, places, and things that are important to you and you experience connection around. But I also think it's about a willingness to open up and to be vulnerable and to be oneself. And I think, listeners, if you practice that, you can get curious and reflect on like, how is that impacting my level of connection? And if I want or need more, what can I do? This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes